What makes you happy?
Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismail, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. For today's episode, I had the amazing opportunity to talk to Benjamin Casteillo. Benjamin exited the corporate world, increasingly concerned about the unsustainable trajectory of our civilization, to find out why is humanity on a path of self-destruction and how can we change course. A deep transformation journey led him to uncover great knowledge that can refine our understanding of reality and increase our individual and collective sense-making abilities. The human species has reached a critical point. Globalization, carried by a consumerist, productivist, materialistic economy driven by competition for short-term profits, unlimited accumulation of capital, and compulsive growth, appears to have gone awry. An increasing number of alarming reports point at the destruction of our planetary ecosystems, biodiversity loss, climate change, growing social inequalities, rising polarization, an increasingly fragmented and vulnerable society. In this very personal episode, we talk about how to deal with the difficult realization that you are contributing towards a self-destructing system. We talk about finding inner peace, our global sustainability crisis, and its root causes. You will learn about Benjamin's very personal journey and what he has learned ever since he left his successful career in the corporate world. We talk about prime human instincts and belief systems. We elaborate on the Anthropocene and we discuss individualization. You will learn about the importance of empathy and why it can be so difficult to challenge global paradigms that are still accepted by the majority of humanity. Many of us feel that the time for change has arrived, yet it remains difficult to act upon it. You will hear why, and we discuss concrete steps towards a more sustainable future for all of us. We are all interconnected. And even though local initiatives are needed and important, we cannot neglect the fact that we need a much bigger shift of our mindsets and actions. And with that, Benjamin, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Thank you, Ismail, for having me. How do I feel? I guess it's a bunch of feelings, but excitement. And what is on my mind is I'm very curious to see where this conversation is going to take us.
Wonderful. Likewise, I'm also very excited to have this conversation. And Benjamin, we're going to talk about a bunch of different topics, and we're also going to talk about the research that you have been conducting. And before we talk about such topic in depth, I think it would be valuable also for our listeners to get a little bit of context. And I suppose that the year of 2017 was a very important one for yourself. So maybe we can start a little bit with what happened before 2017 and then what were also happenings in 2017 and after, if you want to help us a little bit.
Absolutely. So 2017 was a very important year for me because it was the year of my personal shift. There was really a before and an after 2017. Before 2017, I've been someone who's been trying to fit in and to have a job, to have a salary, to have the life that society was presenting to me as a successful life. And this was done at great expenses. And what I say great expenses is that it came at the price of suppressing myself. And in order to fit in order to be able to have access to this success, what society calls success. And I had it. And I had and in 2016, I was at the peak of my corporate career. I had money, power, status, recognition. But I would have definitely have stayed there if it wasn't for an increasingly disturbing feeling that I am part of a system that's bringing humanity on the verge of collapse. That is not sustainable simply because it is not sustainable. And 2017 was a year that started with a meditative retreat, because basically I was trying to find inner peace as I was increasingly disturbed by a state of cognitive dissonance between my professional reality, that identity of successful senior manager, and the real world reality that I am part of a system that is not sustainable. And that meditative retreat was extremely transformative because it opened a new dimension to me, which was the dimension of interiority or inner dimension, which before 2017, I wasn't even aware it existed. And for me, I think this led to profound transformation, because as soon as the door of my inner world opened, I felt that what I was touching, or what I was heading towards, was something that could help me to understand why we are self-destructive as a species and how we could fix it. So in a way, during the meditative retreats, my intention moved from finding inner peace to understanding the root causes of our problem. And that led to profound changes. And it led me to quit my corporate career to start this project of transdisciplinary research education, which aimed at uncovering and treating the root causes behind the crisis of sustainability that we are facing through our globalized civilization.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that. And I would be very interested, Benjamin, you said you went to a meditative retreat, and we're going to talk about inner peace and the inner world in more depth for sure. But I don't know if there was a moment or an inspiration that made you go to this meditative retreat, or was it something that built up over time? Did you start meditating by yourself? Did you look into other ways of understanding yourself? Did you listen to a podcast? Did you read a particular book? Was it just a feeling in your stomach that made you go? I don't know if there was one thing, if there were many things that made you question, let's just call it, and then also act upon it.
So I think the fact that I had repressed myself for so long to fit in mean that I was living with an inner tension within me, and that either tension had already led to breakdowns in the past, and therefore I was looking at meditation as a tool to regulate myself, to regulate this tension. And unfortunately, the fact that I became more and more aware that systems I'm part of are not sustainable made that tension increase. And so in 2017, I would say that I was at the top of my corporate career, but I was at the lowest I have ever been mentally and emotionally. It's like nothing in my life was making sense. And I was very lost because I thought that being successful professionally would provide me peace and happiness and fulfillment. And instead, what I was getting was inner conflict, frustration, and depression. And so I used the meditative retreat was a getaway, a potential solution to resolve this this condition that was obviously not pleasant.
Okay, so it was basically a process that had started before, and you were trying to apply this tool to thoughts that were already happening and to an understanding that you're not living the happy, successful blend into society life. Thank you very much for that clarification. And I have another follow-up question, and that is, why is this inner dimension of each and every individual such an important one if we talk about change also on a broader scale for society and for humanity?
That's a very important question. So if we don't have access to this inner dimension, basically it's become much harder to change patterns that are deep-rooted within us. So the inner dimension opens a getaway toward the unconscious. And the unconscious is still what drives most of our behaviors. There's this very famous saying from, well, not very famous, but at least there's this saying from Carl Gustav Jung that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The inner dimension is what contains the unconscious. So driving toward the inner self is the way to make the unconscious conscious and to take, I don't like the word control, but to develop our ability to direct our life. And we were speaking about society. Why is it such an important aspect to change our society? Because mainly our society is established on unconscious mechanism. And so it is very hard to transform this society if we don't make the unconscious mechanism on which it is established conscious, which implies if we don't dive inward individually and collectively.
And if I'm not mistaken, this diving in and learning a lot on an individual level for yourself also led you to acknowledgement and to understandings that were very not pleasant, if you want to say so, to a kind of mental breakdown, right?
Absolutely. So probably to be precise, diving inward is reconnecting to ourselves, but it's also reconnecting to parts of ourselves that have been repressed and suppressed. Because they've been suppressed and repressed, this part of ourselves may contain a lot of unpleasant emotions: anger, frustration, sadness. Therefore, reconnecting to the part of ourselves that we have suppressed is reconnecting to these unpleasant emotions. And that's where there's something that is really key to be able to do it, is to have the ability to process these emotions, to let these emotions go through us. And of course, they're not only emotions, they will also come with thoughts. So to me, particularly, like this self-reconnection was very destabilizing because I got overwhelmed with thoughts and emotions that I wasn't conscious enough to identify as such, which means that nobody had prepared me for this process. And it took me a while and a lot of practices to develop the consciousness needed to be able to go through this without letting myself being taken over by them. In other way, if you are going through a lot of anger, if you're processing a lot of anger, it's very likely that this anger will also come with thoughts that are going to rationalize and justify the anger. If one doesn't have the ability to observe these thoughts for what they are not the truth. They are simply the thoughts that come with the anger, and also to identify the emotions that is under this. One will likely identify with this emotion and this thought and act upon them. It took me a while to be able to recognize that. And a lot of, or at least some painful experiences. But ultimately, I was able to process this without letting myself being carried away by it. And so that became a game changer because I was able to process some truly deep wounds. Ultimately, what these uncomfortable emotions, disturbing emotions and thoughts relate to is they relate to wounds that can be things that we've experienced in childhood, but also things that relate to our ancestors, to our society. And so, yeah, this was for me the biggest challenge, is to be able to process this without being carried away, without getting unbalanced mentally and emotionally.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Benjamin. And I have another personal question, and that is, if you look back, is there something that you wish you had when going through that process? And that something could be information, could be a network of people, could be a guiding hand, could be really anything. I don't know if something comes to mind.
Absolutely. So basically, all the knowledge, all the understanding I'm sharing today is something I didn't have back in the day. And I wasn't surrounded by people who had this experience. And so at the time, it was extremely stigmatizing. I mean, people basically labeled me with some pretty bad mental illness, and they did not understand the process I was going through. And I didn't understand it myself. And it's only, it took me basically a year and a half to find balance on the other side, or at least enough balance to not, because I haven't mentioned it, but during that process, I was also placed in mental institutions. And these mental institutions did not understand either what I was going through. They had a very reductive way of looking at my process. For them, it was brain chemistry unbalance, and it had to be medicated. And they had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever about the traumas, the fears that I was processing. I also would have loved to know that I was not only processing my own traumas, but and my own irrationality, but in many aspects, I was also processing traumas from society and irrational way of thinking that are deep-rooted in our social structures. I didn't have that. And I was lucky I made it on the other side, because I think a lot of people without that understanding really come to believe that they are chronically mentally ill and end up spending their life on medication. And I think this is absolutely dramatic and a consequence of these reductive, materialist ways of looking at human beings and their psychology.
Thank you very much for sharing that very personal experience. And if we talk about the other side, and if we talk about gaining this knowledge, I believe that this is also the ambition you have behind New World Together, and why today you want to educate and share information. And we can maybe start off with, what is New World Together and what do you do with it today?
So New World Together is a ever-evolving project. And I say that because one of the first realization I had out of this process is that it was our division and rivalries that were bringing us on the verge of disaster. And that finally, the global sustainability challenges that we face are a call for unity. And so New World Together started with the ambition of sharing that message and of structuring information that will allow people to realize that. And what I quickly realized is that I started making conferences and telling people about, for example, how the overshoot of our planetary limits is a call for collaboration and stepping out of this paradigm of competition in which we are. And what I realized is that I was touching something much deeper when I was communicating these things to people, and that people were not ready to go that deep. But basically, it will activate resistance mechanism. And I thought, okay, so this resistance mechanism is what's keeping us into this old paradigm. And we need to understand them in order to be able to transcend them. And that's how New World Together very organically evolved towards what it is today, which is a transdisciplinary research and education project, which is dedicated to uncover and treat the root causes of our problems. Knowing that when I say that, for many people will say, oh, but all these problems are different. We can't really compare. For example, climate change is not rising inequalities and it's not famines. And what we've discovered is that all these problems were interrelated with one another, but not only interrelated with one another, they share common root causes, which stems out the dimension we were talking about. These root causes are within us. They are unconscious mechanisms that drives our behavior below our level of awareness, individually and collectively, and in very different ways from one individual to another, although also with pretty clear collective patterns. And so New World Together now is dedicated to make this mechanism conscious, so that simply they can be recalibrated from the individual to the collective.
And I think this is what one understands at some point, that we have all those different challenges or all those different examples, let's call it different systems, education, healthcare, economic, and so forth. And they in fact do need to change, and they do need to change in sync, because they are in fact not isolated. And you talked about root causes, and you also talked about resistance mechanisms that have been there for a long time. And I would be very interested to dig a little bit deeper if you can share with us a little bit what the root causes, or some root causes, for the current state may be.
So for the root causes, I will try to give first a simple explanation, and then we will dive a little bit deeper to explore what I'm meaning by that. To be clear, we are speaking about the root causes of the sustainability crisis that we are facing as a global civilization. Let me first probably explain before I go to the root causes, the fundamental causes. The sustainability crisis is the result of the way we interact with ourselves, one another, and the rest of the world. In other words, they are the result of our collective behaviors, our collective choices and actions. It is because we function in certain ways that we have a sustainability crisis. Now, most people know that the vast majority of our human behaviors stem out of unconscious mechanisms. Do you know what is the percentage? So it's estimated that around 95% of our choices stem out of unconscious mechanism. And that works at the individual level. Of course, that works at the collective level. It's probably even bigger at the collective level, but nevertheless, let's say it's 90%. So what do you think, if I ask you the question, do you think the sustainability crisis is the result of 10% conscious choices we make? And that means that we are consciously choosing to put ourselves in that situation? Or do you think it stems out of unconscious mechanism? Means that there is mechanism that drive us below our level of awareness toward a collapse of our civilization.
Logically, it rather stems from the 90%, and my personal view on that is that the other 10%, at least parts of the other 10%, are very deliberate choices of the system itself, in a way, that fuel those unconscious choices in order to compete, in order to satisfy greed, in order to optimize profits, and so forth. But the vast majority is the unconscious choices that we take that are somewhat fueled by the profiteers of this very interrelated system of things.
So absolutely. So I think you mentioned it exactly right. So mostly it's unconscious mechanism. So we've been exploring, we've also taken that assumption or that hypothesis. Okay, we are not collectively, consciously choosing this. This is unconscious choices that we are making. And so we've explored this unconscious and we found that what is going to structure the unconscious is mostly the experiences of the past. And particularly experiences that are associated with survival. And what we found exploring that past is that actually the past of humanity has been pretty grim. Our ancestors have been through, they had to face many dangers of hostility. It was predators, rivals, extreme natural events, illnesses. There was a danger of scarcity, the danger of not having enough resources for yourself, for your family, for your tribe. And then there was the danger of separation, the danger of being rejected, persecuted, marginalized by the group, because we are social beings. We don't thrive by ourselves. We thrive as a group. And so basically, we are speaking about dangers that were not experienced just over one generation. We're speaking about danger that is being experienced for generations and generations, for millions of years. And what happened is that a danger called for a survival response. And a fear, basically, out of fear. And so what our ancestors have learned is to fear hostility, scarcity, and separation, and to provide a response to these dangers. And some response came up to become dominant, to become those who who are going to allow for the biggest expansion or the biggest rate of survival. And for us humans, the response that that offered the biggest rate of survival is a response of domination of the external environment to face the danger of hostility, a response of accumulations of resources to face the danger of scarcity, and a response of conformism to dominant norms to face the danger of separation. And so these responses have structured our survival instinct, or at least the one that has become dominant. Why it has become dominant? Simply because the groups that were doing best at domination, accumulation, and conformism are the ones that thrived, that expanded the most in the world, that colonized the rest of the world. So in here, I think you know exactly which group I'm talking about. We are talking about groups that are originally from Western Europe. And so this impulse of survival, they did not only drive our unconscious survival instinct, they also structured our society. So on the impulse of domination led to the creation of powerful nations that aim at defending territory from external threats, but also at expanding these territories, or at trying to expand military, economic, cultural agendas. Out of the impulse of accumulation came capitalism in its current form, which places economic actors in competition with one another for short-term profits, unlimited accumulation of capital, and growth. And then from the impulse of conformism came all our social norms that are being perpetuated by our current institutions, our educational system, our justice system, our religions. And so we came up with a primal survival instinct that has become strongly embedded in our society, and that is becoming more and more outdated in our current time. To understand why it has become outdated, one needs to understand the Anthropocene. So for those who are not familiar with the word Anthropocene, the Anthropocene defines an era in which humans are able to dominate and transform their natural environment. And it's just a few centuries old. Before, we humans were entirely part of the natural environment. We were not in a position to dominate it, not in a position to transform it. And the primal survival instinct I just described has been built prior to the Anthropocene and is becoming increasingly unsustainable within the Anthropocene simply because the Anthropocene sees an exponential increase of technological progress. And what that exponential progress does, it amplifies the destructive consequences of these primal survival patterns. So the impulse of domination, which is going to a lot of rivalry for power, will translate into weapons of mass destructions because it's generating conflicts for power. The impulse of accumulation will generate an industrial tool that is hungry for always more growth that will lead to the overshoot of our planetary limits. And the impulse to conform combined with exponential tech will lead to a reinforcement of social norms through technologies, whether they are social medias or systems of surveillance. And we are speaking here about social norms that are mainly defined by those who are at the top of the game of domination and accumulation and that are not sustainable in the Anthropocene. And so what we see is a system that cannot be sustainable in the new era, which is the era of technology, the era of the domination of humanity on Earth, but which implies that humans are now the stewards of the planet and have to behave as such. Because if they perpetuate their predatory ways, they are endangering themselves on a global scale.
And I would like to use that to detail something we were discussing a little bit earlier. And we talked about the Anthropocene, we talked about the domination of nature. And earlier in our conversation, you already mentioned societal trauma. So how has this domination of the natural world, putting the human above anything else, created individual, but also and especially societal traumas?
So if you don't mind, I see it in a different way. Is that it did not create the trauma, it's established on trauma. So basically, it's important to understand that any situation in which we experience danger or suffering is by nature traumatizing. And what trauma does, it's not the situation itself that is traumatizing, but the trauma is the wound that is left out of the psychic or psychological wound that is left by the situation. Doesn't mean that the situation has to be traumatizing, but very often it leads to trauma. And so what trauma does is that it creates a sense of separation with the self. Because basically the trauma is an emotional charge that is left within my body. It's really a painful emotional charge. And what most humans do to not feel the emotional charge is they numb it. They create a separation between themselves and that emotional charge. And so basically people who tend to be very affected by traumas is also people who really tend to numb many wounded parts of themselves to not feel the emotional pain associated with trauma. What this does is that it's going to create a sense of separation and an existential anxiety. That existential anxiety will be compensated, rationalized with belief systems on which we are going to build our structures, especially when we are speaking about collective traumas. So to give you probably a more tangible example, we humans have experienced many trauma of scarcity because we've been through a lot of famines, we've experienced extreme poverty, severe deprivation. And so that's traumatic. What happened is that this trauma of scarcity is going to generate fear. But you guess what kind of fear it's going to generate?
Well, existential fear for survival, somewhat?
Yes. But what do you think the trauma of scarcity creates as a type of fear?
That there will not be enough, and hence that I have to compete with Benjamin and the other farmers or the other corporate managers or you name it in order to get enough for myself and then maybe my family and then maybe my small community.
So here you got the fear is the fear of not having enough. What you're speaking after is the belief. I fear not having enough. So my belief is, oh, there's not enough for everyone. So therefore, I need to compete with others for resources. Right. And what is this competition with others to accumulate resources is going to create?
The belief that there is not enough and that I need to put myself higher above next to somebody else.
Sure. So basically, that's also the consequence. But the first thing it's going to create is scarcity. Because if we are all in competition to have always more, we manufacture scarcity with our own behavior, and there's never enough. And so And so this is kind of a traumatic stress response that is going to feed itself. And so you have that with the trauma of scarcity, but you also have that with the trauma of hostility. The trauma of hostility will generate the fear of others, or, man is a wolf to man, and therefore I must be afraid of fellow humans, right? Which means we need to protect ourselves with borders, etc., whatever comes up, right? So, but basically, and that is also going to feed the impulse of domination, that is going to feed the rivalry for power, and the rivalry for power will feed the trauma of hostility. And so what we have is a self-perpetuating survival mechanism that are completely obsolete in our time and that are increasingly self-destructive with technological progress. And those survival mechanisms are deep-rooted in traumas that are not only individual traumas, but that are collective and intergenerational traumas.
And the same is somewhat true for separation and the belief system or the way of functioning of individualization that we have seen happening, at least over the past century, if you would ask my opinion. And maybe we can also talk to that a little bit, because in today's world, what I see and what I also get a lot of as feedback, even to the episodes that we create with the Just Another Mindset podcast, is there are different understandings, let's just say, and some, if not many, say, yes, I do see the point and I do understand where we stand, but it's somewhat too late, so I will go and focus on myself and my small group, let's call it my family, and then on my small community. But this inevitably, if I follow the logic that you had described earlier, fuels again the separation, the hostility, and the scarcity, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So what you're saying here is that basically the primal impulse of domination and accumulation are interrelated with the primal response of conformism, but they're related. They create this paradigm of separation. Basically, what we're telling ourselves because of our pattern is that the world is dangerous and I got to fit in within my group, so in order to survive. And so basically, I'm going to conform to whatever norms is there, and I'm going to do it in a very unconscious way. I mean, I'm even going to identify with this norm. So when we blindly conform to norms, generally what we have to do is to repress parts of ourselves. We have to repress our authenticity in order to fit in. If I repress my authenticity, am I likely to accept someone else's authenticity? Not really. If it challenge what I have repressed, I'm unlikely to accept it. So basically, if I repress the difference within me, very likely I will repress it outside of me. And so that pattern creates the same self-perpetuating mechanism. And it's, of course, also deep-rooted in trauma, because it's traumatizing when one human being has to convince himself that it's too dangerous to be authentic and that he will have to follow the norms that are dictated by his parents, the educational system, the professional environment. And so you're rightful to mention that all these patterns are interrelated with one another, right? And there is no dealing with the unsustainable patterns of domination without dealing with the unsustainable patterns of accumulation and conformism. This is why we need a more systemic, a deeper approach to the problems that we are facing, and a more especially human-centered approach. We cannot just see the crisis we are facing as something that we need to fix outside of ourselves. We need to recognize it as a call to recognize and address issues that are within ourselves. And these issues don't make us bad or unacceptable. They make us simply humans with an heritage that have to become conscious of that heritage in order to integrate and transcend it. I really want to say that because I don't want this to come, as another judgment about ourselves, or we are not good enough, we are bad. It's not that. Actually, we are extremely amazing beings. And I also want to mention that these traumas that I'm talking about, they are an amazing potential for evolution. I am not sure, have you already heard the term post-traumatic growth? So post-traumatic growth for us, the way I describe it, and you work together, is an expansion of our level of self-awareness, of our level of knowledge, and of our level of empathy. Therefore, by having so many unacknowledged and unresolved collective and intentional traumas, we also have a pool of consciousness, of knowledge and empathy to help us evolve and overcome the challenges of our times. And I think this is amazing. But in order to untap this potential, we need to recognize it is there, and we need to recognize specifically the wounds, the fear, and the beliefs from a bygone past on which we are still running very unconsciously, and the fact that many of them are not sustainable in our times. But they can be brought to consciousness. The traumas can be healed. The limiting fears can be released. The false belief can be deconstructed. And that's the process in which we are invited, to take today.
And Benjamin, before we talk about this empathy and this post-traumatic growth, you mentioned the interconnectivity, and we also talked about finding answers within yourself. Why is it not the right approach to say, okay, Benjamin and Ismail and 5 other people or 500 other people have a solution that works, but that we must see it at a larger scale for the entire humanity? What I mean by that, in order to make it more explicit, is Benjamin and Ismail could now understand and say, okay, we move with 2 people, with 5 people, with 500 people, somewhere where we disconnect ourselves from the non-functioning systems we have identified. But sooner or later, this disconnect will pull us back, because this is a condition that we have on a broader scale and not in small groups. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. So I think I see a lot of people and communities that think that the solution is to basically build communities and become independent from the unsustainable systems. And this is probably a step toward the solution. But in my view, at least, this is not the solution, because if tomorrow those global systems collapse, where people are going to go where they can. And so basically you might have a very independent community with your permaculture and gardens. But if tomorrow a city filled with millions of people empty itself, and people are basically trying to find food, they're going to come to your door. And so the problem is going to knock at your door one way or another. So I think it is not realistic to think that the solution can be limited to small scale. I'm not saying that the solution as a small scale is not a good start. It's a great start. I think we must first be able to discover a new way of functioning in small scale, and that making develop and making expand. But I think if we limit ourselves to that and think that we're safe because we've sorted it in our small communities, I think this is very delusional. And it's finally not much better than being super rich and thinking that the solution is to create a a luxury bunker somewhere in the countryside. I think here what we are invited to see is that everything is interrelated. There's no me separated from the rest of the universe, and specifically from the rest of humanity and from what's happening on this planet. And therefore, when we are speaking about collective problems of such a scale, we need a collective response. And I'm not saying that an uniform collective response where everybody has to do the same thing, but a collaborative and diverse response in which everyone learn to evolve to be part of the solution in their own ways. So I don't know if I respond to your questions, but thank you for asking it, because I think this is a very important subject that's very often not properly discussed, in my view.
No, absolutely, you did. And I find it very interesting to listen to that, because I do agree. I think it's a very good start to say to live in a community and to try alternative ways of living with permaculture, with having your own water system and living in a more sustainable, more natural way with our planet. But we have to either connect all the small communities and small networks and hope that this will be the scale that we can aim at, or still be connected to the somewhat majority of humanity in order to find solutions for that as well. And I have a follow-up question for that, Benjamin, because depending on which circles you are in and with whom you talk about, this is all acknowledged. And you said a key word for me, and this is empathy. And I believe, and it's also personally in my experience, in my learning, it sometimes was, at least, and probably it still is, sometimes difficult to be fully empathetic, especially if we have certain corporations, certain leaders of nations. How do you remind yourself that empathy is one of the keys? I'm not suggesting there's this one key, but one of the main driving factors that we all have to inherit, and we also have to accept different stages of the journey somehow. So that was a long question, but how do you stay empathetic to people who share very different belief systems that are based on what we discussed earlier?
So basically, I constantly remind myself that people are not their beliefs. They are not the social structures they are subjugated to. They are not their behaviors. So I differentiate the being and the program on which the being is running, especially when the program is unconscious. And so for me, the problem is not with the being, it's with the program on which it is running. Right? You can have a very good computer, but if the software on which it is operating is corrupted, the computer is going to appear to be corrupted. But it's the software that needs an upgrade, not the computer that needs to be rejected and thrown away.
And I think this is one of the reasons why we have a lot of developments that are somewhat negotiable, let's say, or sometimes even scary. And you have a lot of good-willed people that actually want to save the world, that actually want to do good. But if they are led by the wrong or by different belief systems, it's difficult to say wrong, but by different belief systems, they somewhat play into an old narrative again. That's also what I hear.
So that's exactly right. So recently I came across the testimony of Prince Charles during his engagement in Afghanistan. And he was telling how he had been trained by the military to see the people he was killing as the baddies and the enemies to shoot. And that was really interesting for me, because if I look at the Taliban, for example, I see a lot of great human qualities. But I see that the problem is coming from the belief system from which they are operating. So it's people who are really dedicated to, do what is right and are ready to take weapons and fight for what they believe is right, but their belief is completely irrational and corrupted and divisive. And so the problem is not with these people, it's with the belief on which they are operating. And so if the problem is the belief, then why is the first response to, coming from the military, why are we not having more open discussions about our belief systems? This is really important for me because I'm going to give you this example, right? I don't know what's your brand of phone. Mine is a Realme. I know some people use Oppo, some people use Apple, some people use whatever, right? You agree the phone is a tool, right? It's a tool that helps you to interact with the world. Right? Are we devising ourselves based on the brand of phones that we have?
You and I don't.
Well, I think what some people do, but I don't see much people, right? There's not many. We don't have conflicts based on at least not violent conflicts. Well, I see a belief system as tools, just as our phones, right? A belief system is a tool that I'm going to use to structure my mind, to structure my relationship with the world, my values. So technically, if it's a tool, I'm supposed to be able to upgrade it. I'm supposed to be able to evolve it. Right now, in our current paradigm, most people are still unconsciously subjugated to their own belief systems. And I'm saying that very clearly, because if it wasn't the case, then we wouldn't say this guy is a Christian, this guy is a Jew, this guy is a Muslim. Right? I'm not being called Realme, you're not being called Apple or whatever. It's like we understand that this is not who we are. But with belief systems, we have not come to the level of consciousness to realize that this is not who we are. This is simply tools we are using. And because we are identified with these beliefs, they take control over us. They divide us. They determine how we function. And we don't even have the power to deconstruct what needs to be deconstructed, to evolve what needs to evolve. And so here I'm talking about the problem caused by collective belief systems that are dogmatic and that are at the base of our society. So I don't know where we started all of that, but what I'm saying here is that probably something that I should add is that those belief systems are extremely powerful because very often they are deep-rooted in fear and trauma, right? Generally, when you have a strong dogmatic belief, is that because it's compensating for a deep fear and a deep trauma. And for that person to deconstruct the belief means they will have to face the fear and the trauma. I give you an example. If you're Christian, you're convinced that Jesus is the way to God and the way to not be punished by God, right? There's a deep fear behind that. The fear of separation with God, the fear of punishment from God. You cannot deconstruct this belief that's compensating for this fear if you don't go through the fear and the underneath trauma, the trauma of separation behind it. And so I really forgot what took us there in the first place. But what I'm saying here is that at the core of the problem that we face are these dogmatic beliefs that have determined our identities and somehow subjugated us very unconsciously. And today, which we need to break free from, because many of them need to be evolved, simply because our universe is constantly evolving. Our level of knowledge is constantly evolving. If our beliefs are not evolving too, they become disconnected from the reality which we share. They become disconnected from knowledge. And therefore they become unsustainable. And they become unsustainable together with whatever society we've built on top of them. So, yeah, I don't know. I hope this is insightful. I totally forgot what brought us there. Forgive me for that. But I hope this is insightful because I think it's a very important subject.
Absolutely it is. And we started the segue with talking about empathy and how do you stay empathetic for different groups, people, and so forth. And I actually have one follow-up question, and I want to make very clear that this is not an exhaustive list, but what you just described, what I have seen, what I have experienced, and what I therefore see as common traits, what can happen are two things, and I don't know if you have any thoughts or ideas on that. One is to describe yourself and maybe a group of people as something more developed, as something more conscious, as something, and this is happening in the spiritual world, this is happening with communities. This is one, for me, somewhat difficult understanding. And another one, and I think this is what you touched on also with Prince Charles, is the narrative of dehumanization. So as soon as I and Benjamin decided that group of people A or nation B or corporation C is not human, this is what made humans do very inhumane things to other people. So I don't know if we have any thoughts on either of the one, lifting ourselves up or lifting the other group down.
So I'm going to go, I think for me, the key to resolve this is to have enough discernment to make the difference between the humans and the systems that are operating and that today dominating humans, right? Because today mostly we're still subjugated to our systems. It's kind of a matrix type scenario where out of survival, we build systems that are deep rooted in fear and we subjugate ourselves to these systems out of fear. And so right now it's important to dissociate humans and systems. Humans are not their systems. They are not their belief system. They are not their society, right? They are humans. And very often they believe they are their systems because they haven't realized, they haven't reached the level of consciousness to discern, to realize that they are not, that these are simply constructs very often that are intergenerational, that are inherited from a past that can be centuries old. And so here, what I'm speaking about is really key to not dehumanize ourselves, is to remember that we are all human beings and we are all mostly still subjugated to systems that we haven't even created consciously, right? And that our task as human right now is to become conscious of it so that we can transform these systems so that they can become sustainable. Because right now, they are not sustainable. Right now, they are taking us towards undesirable future. And so for me, that's really having the ability, the level of perception to differentiate humans and their systems is the key. And remembering that we are all humans. We are all humans. And most of us are not yet aware of what is driving them and of the nature of the systems driving them. We're simply trying our best to survive in a world that appears very chaotic and scary. And so reminding myself this allow me to reach some level of empathy intellectually, even if I have to say, as a male, it is sometimes very hard for this level of empathy to be felt. But I can feel anger toward my peers for their blindness and for their unconsciousness. But intellectually, I'm able to remind myself, okay, like they're just not aware of what they are doing. And it's not by being angry and confrontational that we are going to solve this problem. It's by bringing consciousness to where there was none before.
Let's use that and talk a little bit about the human's creative power, or what I have been talking on this podcast also many times, the collective brain power that we as humans can put together in order to acknowledge the situation where we are and try to figure out ways or going forward.
So I think a lot for me of our creative power stem out of our thoughts. And so the more we have the capacity to choose our thoughts, the more we have the capacity to choose the level of our creation. I'm going to be a bit more clear. Before it became something material, was a thought. And this was thought because there was an intention. Very often, we do create all of our thoughts very impulsively, very unconsciously. We are not very aware of our intentions. We are not aware of what drives our thoughts. And therefore, our creation is also very unconscious. I would argue that if this was a conscious creation, it will probably be designed to serve humanity. Because it's mainly an unconscious creation, it is also designed to exploit humanity. It's designed to capture my intention against my best interest in order to sell me advertising space, notably, right? So this is what I'm speaking about when I'm speaking about unconscious creations, is that we are creating all these tools through our thought process, through our intentions, but we are not necessarily aware of this thought process and these intentions. I think if we were aware of that, then we will start to create these tools more consciously. And I'm not only speaking about material tools, I'm also speaking about organizations, entities, businesses. When I created New World Together, I didn't know I was gonna shape myself. I created out of fear. So I got to do something because we're heading toward disaster, and I need to step up and do something. So I created New World Together. What I didn't know is that by creating New World Together, I was creating an entity that would determine a lot of my thoughts, a lot of my intention, a lot of the way I function. I became aware later, and I say, wow, I access all this knowledge because I created that entities, but I didn't know I was going to do it in the first place. What I'm saying is that when we are creating social constructs, we are also shaping ourselves, who we are going to become. And very often people don't think about what they are going to become when they create a business. They think how much money they can make, right? If I had thought what is the best way to make money, and the response would have been plastic in business, business in plastic, selling plastic cups because there's a big consumption of plastic cups in Indonesia, then you would have the same person in front of you, but with a completely different process of thinking, completely different value system, completely different intention and drive, right? So what I'm saying when I'm speaking about our creative power, I want to say that we have the power to create the social constructs that are going to determine our relationship with the world. And we should be very careful, mindful, and conscious of what we are creating, because this determines how we relate with the world. And especially now, at a time in which the way we relate to the world is called to evolve so that it can become sustainable. So long story short, we have so much creative power, and until now, we've mainly been using them unconsciously. Our ability to make this creative power conscious is a key part of the solution to transform our societies so that they can become sustainable.
No, I do agree. And Benjamin, we talked a lot about different findings, let's just call it, of the work that you have been doing over the past years. And when we talk about this global sustainability, what also helps me oftentimes is to say, okay, are there tangible tools or techniques or way forward if we talk about a transition? Meaning, is there something after the acknowledgement that our listeners can look at and understand this could be a way forward? I don't know if something comes to mind.
Sure, of course. So we are talking about change, individual, collective, and societal change. The first step for me to a proper change is awareness at the individual level. awareness of what is dysfunctional, what we are invited to change. Awareness is a good step, but if I'm not able to embody the change that needs to happen, basically that's not going to have much of an impact. So the second step is to integrate that change. In that case, because we are talking about a profound change, it means an integration that needs to take place at a profound level. For me, that integration, the main driver is post-traumatic growth. I mean, we are being called to recognize and heal our past traumas and release this fear that are keeping us trapped into those belief systems that do not serve us. That's the second part. The integration is key, because without the integration, I am not able to embody the evolution, the change that is required. Once I'm able to embody it, it is great, but I myself am not enough. I need to build synergies and to collaborate with other people who are who are taking the same call, who share the same intention, right? And I think where we need to go, this conversation that we are having should become mainstream. It should not be on the verge of society. It should become mainstream. This should be in the news. This should be in the public conversation, in the political conversation, in education, etc. Not as a dogma, but as one complementary information to understand where we are, what we are facing, and how we can resolve it. And this is needed for me to achieve the needed collective level of consciousness that can drive the sustainable transformation of our society. And so what I'm saying here in summary is that the change starts from within, out of awareness and integration. And by the way, I am also still working on my process of integration. I am not able to perfectly embody the paradigm that I envision, because it requires work on my own fear and my own trauma, and this takes time. And so in any case, what I'm saying is that it starts from the individual to the collective and to society, and it creates this loop, right? Because individual change pioneer collective change that results in societal change, that create collective change, that foster individual change. And so we have this co-creation loop. And for me, that is the way forward, is to go from awareness to integration, to embodiment, to coalition, to popularization, to societal transformation. And so I don't know if that responds to your question, but to me, for those who are becoming aware of these things, the next step is to be able to integrate it. And don't worry too much, because in a way, I don't like this word. It sounds a bit like spiritual woo-woo, but the universe is going to conspire to make you integrate it. I mean, you are going to be confronted with your own contradiction, with your own bias, and with your misplaced emotions. And this is where empathy is really important, because the point is not to engage in a conflict with yourself, is to embrace these parts of yourself in order to be able to integrate and transcend them.
Benjamin, maybe we can talk about that a little bit, about this change from awareness to integration. And just a couple of thoughts. In our pre-talk, which we had some time ago, we were talking about infrastructures and the lack of such in order to fully integrate this belief system, this working system, into a life that is still somewhat dependent on the old system. That's one thing. And how do you also, because I have an issue, or not an issue, but a challenge for myself, and that is that I'm somewhat consequent This is what many people, many of my good friends would tell. If I find something, if I want to do something, I'm very consequent and somewhat stubborn or strict about it. So once you go into this individual awareness process, let's just call it, and then you want to integrate it, how do you not burn bridges that you may or may not use? Or how do you integrate in a way that still keeps you going? I don't know if this is too abstract of a question or if you already know what I'm pointing at.
So I don't know, because this is very personal. I can only relate to my own experiences. I can tell you that sometimes I feel about giving up. I feel about just forgetting about all of this and numb myself any way I can. Drugs, video games, whatever. And but for me, it's like I can't do that without being fully aware that I'm doing it. So that doesn't work because I'm like, I can totally see what I'm doing and the nonsense of it. So I'm not able to do it personally. No, generally, if I get a bit burned out, it means I'm impatient. I want things to, I don't take the time. I don't give myself the time that I need. So how do we, what keeps me going is the constant evolution. Is that I can look back at who I was a few years back and I can see the progress made. And probably what will completely stop me is if I had to stop to survive. If, let's say, it was becoming so unsafe around me that I had no spare energy to consider, to give to the expansion of my consciousness, and I was to focus on primal survival, no matter what that means, warlike environments or thing. But I would think this will only be a transition, because this kind of unsafe environments normally don't last forever or they kill you. Yeah, to me, it's all these things. It's first, I can't go back without being fully aware that I'm basically betraying myself deeply. I see constant evolution, and it's more about accepting that the process takes more time than my ego would like it to take. My ego would love things to just go, yeah, awareness and transformation, and just like that. And no, it takes time, because there is a lot of wounds to process, fear to process that are deeply entrenched. And we are talking about, I'm talking about stuff that is not just concerning me, but my parents, my grandparents. We're talking about stuff that has been there for a long time, and it's definitely cannot just live out of magic. So accepting that this is the process, I think, is also the key. It's part of the process, and reminding ourselves why we're doing it. I think it's very important to know why. Why am I doing this stuff? What I know, because not doing it will be part of a problem that's endangering our human species, and that would be very irresponsible, especially when I'm equipped with that knowledge. Once you know, right? There is this once you know. If I didn't know, I could just pretend. I could just I would not have to confront that reality. But once you know, you can't just forget that you know, and you see it every day.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that personal perspective. And I think you raised 2/3 very important points here. The first one is to allow time and not to become impatient, because things like that will take time. Another one is also imperfection, or understanding that there will be roadblocks, that there will be segues we don't know. And you mentioned that at the very beginning of our conversation. What I really liked is also about your own activities, that they are always evolving. So you're not having this one final answer and creating goals how to get there, but it's like in constant evolvement. And I think those are very important reminders for ourselves, right? And the third one, that goes back to this conscious and unconscious knowing what and maybe this is my wishful thinking, my very personal wishful thinking is, but why we also see a huge increase of people thinking about topics like that, or at least having traumas. And we have I will just call it for the sake of ease now, mental health crisis, is that on a subconscious level, all that is building up so vastly that it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then people, as you said, go into video games, they go into drugs, they go into sports, they go into traveling, they go into, you name it. There are so many coping mechanisms, some of which are better, some of which are potentially worse. But I think it's building up on a subconscious level so vastly. A quote I like to use on this podcast is by Gabor Mate, and he says 60% of US citizens by today use at least one prescription drug. No, 70% use at least one prescription drug, and 60% two. And I think this is also the subconscious level of understanding that is raising. And you and I, let's be honest, do not know if it will take another year, another decade, or another century until this will overflow. And another metaphor that I have used with another guest, Heis, on this podcast is what helps me personally is to accept that I am one small drop in a bucket of water. And I don't necessarily know if I'm the very first drop to fall into that bucket of water, or if I'm the very last drop. So that makes the bucket of water overflowed and tip to the side, and the water is going to spread. And it's also okay not to know if you're the first or the last, because all you and I can do is let's be this drop of water and do whatever we can. So yeah, thank you very much for that personal experience also from your end.
And I would add, it doesn't really matter if you're the first or the last.
Exactly.
What's important is what you're doing and your role, and how you evolve from it and how you enjoy it. And I think that I think this is really important. It doesn't matter what position we're in. It's important. What's important is to be yourselves and to bring something positive to this world.
Benjamin, we talked a lot. There is one topic that I have high on my list still, and we talked about it partially, but maybe we can make it a little bit more explicit. And that is the paradigm of separation and the paradigm of oneness, and how do those two differ and how do those evolve towards each other? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so first I would say that the paradigm of separation is the one in which we live, and I will call it also a paradigm of illusion. Simply because once we understand how the universe works, realize that there's not one element of reality that is intrinsically separated from another. They are all directly or indirectly interrelated. And this is something that is evident once we start to recognize it, but that somehow we haven't acknowledged collectively yet. We're still functioning as if things were separated from one another. We study things in silo. We are divided by nations, by beliefs, by religions, we don't see the interrelation between all the challenges that we're facing. And so this paradigm of separation is also a paradigm that we tend to place ego in the forefront of our decision making, because it's me against the rest of the world. And it fosters a very individualistic and selfish patterns that are at the core of the sustainability crisis that we are facing. It creates selfish patterns, leads to degradation of the commons, very mechanically, very logically. And this in turn leads to us losing faith in ourselves, seeing ourselves as how bad we are and how evil we are. And that will in turn feed the paradigm of the ego, the paradigm of separation, which is based on a misunderstanding about how the universe works. And so one key to break free from it is to recognize that everything in our reality is interrelated, and not only recognizing this, but recognizing the implication of this. If this is, once I recognize that if I win at the expense of the rest of the world, I lose, because I'm debasing what is needed for my well-being. And so this could allow us to upgrade the dominant belief system that are running in our society. The dominant one right now is that, man is wolf to man, and it's the survival of the fittest, and that's just the way nature is, etc. Towards something more like, actually, we are social beings and we need one another, and everything is interrelated, and therefore our behavior needs to evolve to integrate that. So that could foster the collaboration that we need to see happening, notably to integrate our planetary limits. Because I think it's naive to say, oh, we are overshooting our planetary limits, but we're going to fix this by remaining in competition for growth. I think that's absolutely delusional. And so that could foster the needed collaboration that we need to solve our issues. And solving our issues means regaining faith in ourselves and one another. And that could in turn reinforce this new paradigm of oneness. And by oneness, I'm not saying like we are one and the same. I'm saying that we are all part of the same universe, of the same reality. And there is oneness in our uniqueness. We might all be different, but we are all part of the same paradigm. And we got to work together to make it better, because right now we're not heading in the right direction.
Which goes back to the interconnectivity of things and individuals and the collective actions. Benjamin, thank you so much. And there are a couple of questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But before we go there, I have a couple of other questions. And the first one would be, is there any question that you would have really liked me to ask you, and what would have been your answer then?
Not particularly. I'm always welcome the surprise, and I find that the best response, the most insightful response, comes from a question that I do not expect.
I do agree. Thank you very much. Benjamin, if people listen to this conversation and they want to find out more about your work, about you as a person, how do they reach out? How do they engage? And how do they in fact connect?
So they can find our contact through our website, newworldtogether.com. I generally respond to the email that we receive, and especially I invite them to, if they can, to because I do conferences and workshops about these subjects. So to really join one of these conferences or one of these workshops, or to even, if they have the opportunity to organize one, I think this is one way to bring this kind of knowledge, information, and content to the surface, and to help catalyze the change that you and me wants to see.
I do agree. Thank you very much. And then before we go to the final three, Benjamin, what is it that makes you hopeful? And you can answer that question for the day, for the week, for the year, for a lifetime, for humanity.
Simply when I see your potential, untapped potential, and how silly and irrational are the beliefs that are making us not seeing it. That makes me very hopeful, and I hope, and I work on it. I hope we will be able to untap it and see what has always been there, that what we've been too afraid and too blind to see. Yeah. So the potential of humanity for goodness and for evolution.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And based on the conversation that we had, there are many answers that I could imagine for the first of the 3 questions, but I will let you answer, of course. And that is, Benjamin, what is an important truth for yourself that most people don't know or don't talk about?
The fact that we've mistaken a state of traumatic stress and unchangeable human nature.
Thank you very much for that. Benjamin, the second closing question for today's podcast episode is, who are your mentors and whom do you personally look up to?
Oh, I have many of them. I think everybody around me is kind of my mentor. Who inspire me a lot at the moment. We speak about people like Gabor Mate, Thomas Hübel, like Daniel Schmartenberger, and other great thinkers of our time that help us make sense of the challenges that we face and what's causing them and how we can overcome them.
And that leads me to the last and final question of today's episode. And I call it the 3 truths or the 3 facts. And Benjamin, I would like you to imagine that you are traveling all by yourself in space. And actually you travel there for quite some time, for days, for weeks, maybe even for years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species. And they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
We are still at the early stage of our evolution. We are facing great challenges. We are learning to be who we are. We're learning to be ourselves.
An early stage, a challenge, and we are learning. I very much like that, Benjamin. And with that, thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast. And if there is any final words, final statement for the audience today, it's all yours.
Yeah, we are in this together. I just want us to recognize that all over the globe, the challenges that we face, we are facing them together. And I really call for everyone to collaborate as much as possible, to be open to others, to build synergies and to see how we can learn from one another and overcome these challenges in a way that allow us to evolve individually and collectively. So yeah, that's my final call for your audience.
Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Thank you, Ismail, for your time and for having me.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or 2 and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy.
Be yourself positive.
Change.
Just another mindset.